Okay, Drew, whenever you're ready.
Absolutely. So I just wanted, as people are coming in, I want to welcome everyone to our webinar today on patient recruitment, retention, and evaluating celiac disease site performance. Brought to you by the Society for the Study of Celiac Disease. And we'll have two wonderful speakers on today, Dr. Therian, as well as Marilyn Geller. So a little bit about our speakers today. Dr. Therian is a director of research at the Celiac Center at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. She's also an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School. She's a gastroenterologist and clinical researcher with work focusing on improving detection and care for people with celiac disease, particularly those in underserved populations. And then Marilyn Geller is the Chief Executive Officer of the Celiac Disease Foundation, where she leads efforts to accelerate diagnosis, treatment, and a cure for celiac disease through research, education, and advocacy. Under her leadership, the foundation has become a leader in clinical trial recruitment and engagement through initiatives like iCure Celiac, patient registry, helping connect thousands of patients to research opportunities and advanced therapeutic development. So real quick blurb. For those who are interested in collecting CME or CEU from Boston Children's, these are the instructions to do so. If you've done it before, it's a fairly straightforward process. Just text the code that you see right there to the 844 number. And for first-time users, you'll have to create an account, but it's fairly straightforward even then. Without further ado, I would like to move on to our speakers. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction, Drew. So today we're going to talk about physician leader running clinical trials at the hospital site. So the outline is real-world recruitment challenges at the clinical site, site-level recruitment that work, retention from the physician perspective, and optimizing site performance. So one big reality we have to face when we initiate and perform clinical trials is that we are not running technically a private clinical trial company. So oftentimes in academia, we are competing with private independent clinical trial sites. And compared to these sites, you have clinical, academic, other administrative duties. So to be a site PI on a clinical trial can be sometimes challenging. And depending on the size of your center, your city cost of living, your study coordinators may be recent undergraduates who are doing a gap year before graduate school, require more training and supervision than professional senior study coordinators. However, if you eventually have the opportunity to run several trials simultaneously, you can expand your team, hire more study coordinators, have a senior coordinator supervising your team. And it's also very rewarding to be at the center of these trials for new therapeutics for celiac disease. It brings your center closer to the patient's community as a common effort to advance the science, and it offers to your participant the opportunities to do a study with a site and celiac experts who understand celiac disease and can answer their questions. So there's lots of benefit for participants to go to celiac centers run by people in academia. Another major point we will discuss is how enrollment in clinical trials involve either to recruit the patients followed at your celiac center or having outside referrals through patient community like Celiac Disease Foundation or social media ads, and the challenges may be different in each scenario. So let's talk first about unique barriers in recruitment in celiac disease. So celiac disease research is unique, as you know. Several trials will include a gluten challenge. And when you think about it, celiac disease is the only condition where we are inducing the disease to test if a medication works. Several patients are telling us upfront at the clinic that they would like to do a study, but not one that will involve a gluten challenge. So without pushing too much, especially for the ones who we know are symptomatic if they are exposed to gluten, it's good to also relativize the amount of gluten in some studies. So it's maybe less than one slice of bread per week, and that can be reassuring for the participant. Oftentimes, the protocol have several criteria that may delay or prevent the inclusion of your patients in the study. So for celiac disease, we have to make sure that we have the diagnostic biopsy results to confirm that they have a diagnosis of celiac disease. So when they have been diagnosed outside of your center, that may be information to get. The protocol may enroll only people who are HLA DQ 2.5. And in general, it's rare in clinical care for typical celiac disease diagnosis that we do HLA typing. Often there are other comorbidities that could make people ineligible. Some protocol want people who are symptomatic based on certain criteria of like duration of symptoms, intensity, or totally in remission. And finally, some protocol include a screening endoscopy at the end of all of the screening process to check the baseline VHCD at the inclusion of the trial. And oftentimes, after doing all of those efforts, your patient is not eligible because of that screening biopsy. So overall, compared to other GI research, there may be more eligibility criteria data that we have to gain in our people for celiac disease research than like IBD or other GI research. Also, some protocol may involve intensive participation over a short period of time where they are having to come to the clinical research center like 3 times a week, for instance, or the study may span over 6 months with fewer visits. So depending on the patient's schedule, they may not be able to commit to one or the other. Some visit may take the entire day, which could work if the patient is able to work remotely from your site or study if they are a student. For the endoscopy, most sites will want them to have someone they know, a friend, a family member to bring them home after the endoscopy, so they need to coordinate this. Your trial site sometimes may be covering a very large area in your region, such as like 300 miles. So you need flexibility with the study visits for the participants being late in traffic, if there are weather changes. So never plan a study visit at the end of the day if you need like your clinical research center nurses. Also, you may consider planning an hotel for the night before the endoscopy if it's a very early endoscopy and the patient is coming from very far. So lots of logistics to coordinate, and you need a study coordinator quick on their feet and dealing well with last-minute changes. Like I mentioned before, there are 2 main participant recruitment pools. First, the patient followed at your center, and you may already know some who are interested in research and already had at some point all of the tests required to confirm the eligibility for a specific trial. So it helps you to get people enrolled very quickly. However, even if your patients say that they are interested in being contacted for research, it may not be a good timing at this time for them to undergo a specific clinical trial. The type of trial may not be a good fit. And depending on your institution, there may be rules on how to approach your clinical patients for research, which may make the recruitment a bit less straightforward. Having outside referrals can be very useful to boost your recruitment, and a priori, these subjects are interested. They self-enroll to be contacted to undergo a specific clinical trial. However, you do not know those patients, so it involves like phone calls between your study coordinators and those potential participants to evaluate if they really have celiac disease, hear their concerns about gluten exposures, review inclusion-exclusion criteria. It also often involves having the patient obtain their initial blood work, biopsy reports, depending on the eligibility criteria, or if allowed, if your IRB requests these information from your center. So these referrals may involve some phone tag between your team and the participant. Some people sometimes register, but they don't respond to outreach attempts. So down the line, not all of those like referrals end up moving forward for the official in-person screening visit, but it's very important to triage them by phone as you want to be mindful of your time, the participant time. And there's also a consideration of like screen fails in your contract. So you cannot like have an in-person visit with anyone who is like referred for a clinical trial at your site. So you need to pre-screen them. At the major celiac centers, most of our patient population is non-Hispanic white. We do not know if it's truly representative of celiac disease in the USA and whether the disease is underdiagnosed in some ethnic groups. There was in 2024 FDA Diversity Action Plan to improve enrollment in clinical studies. There is a concern that down the line, phase 3 trials in celiac disease will not be deemed representative enough if only Caucasian whites are enrolled. However, not all clinical sites could be ready to have translated consent form, participant documents translate in another language, and our patient-reported outcome questionnaire may not be all validated in other languages. In addition to what we just spoke about, other issues centers may encounter are not being able to keep an up-to-date database of their patient population, especially if it's a very busy center with thousands of patients over the last years, and each day several patients are added or seen. There may not be enough space in the clinic for the study coordinator to meet with the patients afterward to tell them about research study. We also have to be mindful of the coordinator time, especially if you have a small team. If your clinic happens at various remote locations, you cannot have necessarily a study coordinator on site waiting there. And there's always the risk that patients cannot stay, they have a change of schedule last minute. And finally, another situation we are facing is our endoscopy schedule is often booked months ahead of time for clinical care, and some may not have the flexibility to add a case last minute for a screening endoscopy or be flexible to adjust to the patient's schedule. For instance, if the patient can only do Thursdays for their endoscopy. So I spoke about some barriers, but now let's talk about strategies that work. So first, we can briefly integrate trial conversations into clinical care. So at the end of the encounter, I always ask if they have questions about celiac disease and the gluten-free diet. And in that conversation, I introduce current and recent clinical trials. And I ask them down the line if they would agree to be contacted if we think they may be eligible for a clinical trial. And I put them on our list of interested participants and document in the medical record. If you have a clinical trial currently enrolling at your site, it could be helpful to have your study coordinator pre-screen the clinic list, send IRB approved MyChart recruitment messages, contact your patient ahead of the appointment to ask if they would be available to meet with the study coordinator after the appointment. However, as I mentioned before, there's a need to have some flexibility in the clinic environment to have a second room for the study coordinator if you want to have in-person meet and greet. If you have outside referrals or in general, other strategies that work is, of course, flexibility of the study coordinator for screening phone calls to be able to call them in the evening, sometimes on the weekend, as not everybody is able to do weekday phone calls. There's also often text messages or emails if people are more used to that form of communication than regular phone calls, and have a good system to keep track of who was unreachable, who had some biopsy documentation, who we need to get the biopsy documentation and follow weekly. Another thing that is very helpful is when you already have a screening visit schedule to prepare a calendar for the participant to know how would go with the trial, when would they have visit, when will they have an endoscopy, so we can kind of already agree on a schedule if they are found eligible. But however, you should also be flexible for a later start if they know that they have travel plan, periods of unavailability. Sometimes we screen participants, but then we kind of rescreen them because we have them starting the trial a bit later. So we're sure that they're going to be able to do all of the study procedures. It's also good to ask them if they anticipate any medical procedures during the clinical trial, like a random screening colonoscopy or knee replacement. Sometimes those procedures may kind of make a protocol deviation and cause issues with your regular study. And of course, the participants, the study coordinator is frequently checking in and sending text to the participant ahead of the study visit to make sure that they're still coming and they don't have any additional questions about that. So the trust during the first patient interaction. So your study coordinator is key. They need to have great interpersonal skills. At Beth Israel and other center, we found that having a personal connection with celiac disease is a very big help with a study coordinator. Lots of our study coordinators at our centers, other centers, either have celiac disease or have a family member with celiac disease, so they can connect more with the participant. And for instance, for our other study with Latino patients, having a study coordinator from the same community who speak the same language is also very useful for recruitment. As a PI or investigator, it's crucial not to be in a rush for the initial screening visit. I always block 30 to 60 minutes. I go through the entire consent form, even if they have read it before. I want to make sure that they understand and there's no second thought after the fact when they reread it with their partners and they think that we may have hidden something from them. So I really go through all of the pages, all of the paragraph, and at the same time, I answer any questions they may have about celiac disease. And it's important to aim to do the first visit at your clinical research center so the participant can already see the rooms, the nurse, and already feel that it's going to be a very safe, controlled environment. And about the safety oversight, so I explained the study drug mechanism in simple ways. I mentioned how many people have received it so far without serious issues. So in general, it's reassuring. Depending on the protocol, we emphasize how the medication is given in a medical environment. So our clinical research center looks like hospital rooms. It's literally in the hospital. So they feel reassured that we could like intervene rapidly if there is a problem. And same for the first dose of gluten, like some protocols like involve having the first dose in our clinical research center. So that is another like reassuring fact. And I also mentioned that there are safety blood work routinely performed during the study. And those type of blood work, I can share like the results with them. So during the consent process, screening visit, it's also important to assess the reliability of potential participants. We don't want someone who is serious, really considering the research. We don't want to enroll someone and then realize that they have a non-negotiable trip and will not be able to attend like key visits and then unfortunately drop out. We also emphasize how their participation is crucial to obtain reliable data about the drug and celiac disease. It's key that they report presence or absence of symptoms during the screening visit, possible gluten exposures outside of the study, whether they really took their gluten dose or not, whether they kept their contraception, whether they took the study drug. Otherwise, the data will be skewed and we will not really know if the drug works. So we reinforce with our study participant how they play a huge role in the study and advancement of the science in celiac disease. Regarding the gluten exposure, I first explained to the patient that it's essential to know if the drug actually works when we know that the person is having gluten and how much. Hence the need to do simulated gluten exposure with little like granola bars or more significant amounts that will mimic a regular diet. I gave a comparison of how much gluten versus regular foodstuff we are giving. I evaluate if they have been aware of prior gluten exposures and what were their symptoms. Some protocols, like I said before, have first gluten intake at the clinical trial site, so medical supervision may help manage the symptoms. And it's also important to know in advance whether the protocol will allow rescue medication if they have like vomiting, for instance, or a reduction of the gluten dose if they have symptoms. Are they allowed to miss those without withdrawal? And stress the withdrawal of the study, and stress the patient to be honest about their gluten challenge, that we need to know whether they are taking the gluten, and we could perhaps make some adjustment and not stop their participation if they're not taking the entire dose. And when I discuss with patients about the effects of a gluten challenge, I often refer to this study we did in Boston a few years ago. We know that some lower dose of gluten in a limited period may not cause significant change in the intestine. And most importantly, when we look back at the intestine with a capsule endoscopy 4 weeks after the end of the gluten challenge, it was mostly back to normal. I explained that in general, the amount and duration of gluten challenge performed for clinical trials is lower than what we would do in clinical practice to confirm that someone has a diagnosis of celiac disease. And I also explained that T-cell lymphoma usually happen in individuals who have been diagnosed after the age of 50 years old, had decades of uncontrolled celiac disease inflammation, and not after an isolated gluten challenge. So the retention from physician perspective, maintaining the patient confidence throughout the study is key. So I always try to come say hi to participants at each visit, even if there's no like investigator like related like task other than the study coordinator role, and even if sometimes it's brief like between like cases in endoscopy, we always thank them for coming, for their effort for the study. Symptoms may occur either because of the trial drug or the gluten challenge. If I have a patient who had symptoms at their visit on a Friday or who are starting a gluten challenge on a Friday, I always call them on the weekend to see how things are going. It's important to know your protocol well to react and not necessarily wait for the central team input if your participant has like on the spot like symptoms at your clinical research center. If not already specified in the protocol, you may ask ahead of time in the kind of like team meetings which drugs could be okay to help mitigate symptoms, either from the gluten challenge or if there are like known possible adverse events like in prior studies to know what could be like the way of managing that. So because it's reassuring for the study participant to know that their physician readily knows how to address their symptoms if they're having side effects while they are with us at the Clinical Research Center. I always provide or reimburse the over-the-counter medication used for by the participant because of side effect adverse event from the trial. And it's also important to know whether the participant, like I mentioned before, can receive a reduced dose of gluten. Would they still stay in the study if they skip a dose? And discuss with the participant these options if they are sick and may lean towards withdrawing from the study. Essentially, you don't want to hear a few days later from your participant that they stopped taking the IP or the gluten because they were too sick. They must feel comfortable reaching out to you to let you know what is happening and have a conversation about the possible options. And finally, how to optimize site performance. So Marilyn will discuss more about that, but from a physician standpoint. So it's crucial to have a study coordinator with great problem-solving skills and who can face last-minute changes. It's important to always stay in close loop communication with your clinical research center, your research pharmacy, to let them know as soon as possible if there are changes in the schedule. They all have dozens of studies, and to be mindful of their workload goes a long way for them to accommodate you later when you have a real last minute change. And how to optimize the workflow for your own Celiac patient, Celiac Center patient. As I mentioned, aim to have an up-to-date database of your patient population and also keep a list of patients interested in research with a few keywords of like, what were they HLA? Are they symptomatic, not symptomatic? What was their last like biopsy results? Utilize your institution-approved outreach methods for your patient population, either newsletter, MyChart messages, flyers in the clinics, ads on your social media if allowed. And it's always good to pre-screen the clinic list and ask patients ahead of time to see if they would like to meet with your study coordinator after their clinical visit. And in general, other ways to improve enrollment. So your study coordinator should contact the potential participant as soon as referred. Sometimes with outside referrals, it goes by like 10, 12 every day. So you can kind of like accumulate a lot. So you need to stay on track of that. And that can kind of like consume a lot of your study coordinator time at the beginning of those studies. Weekly follow-ups also for biopsy results if they have not been sent, if they're not available. Me and my other co-investigators, we always try to cover like every day of the week for screening visits and visits in general to have more flexibility for our upcoming participants. Like I mentioned before, at the time of the screening visit, have the potential calendar ready for your participant to review, so they can kind of like already pseudo agree on the schedule for their study. What has been helpful also is to have an agreement with the endoscopy unit to be able to add research cases last minute. For us, it's mostly to do like 7:30 a.m. cases before the regular like clinical load. And also share the possible study calendar with your clinical research center and pharmacy as soon as possible. So we do not have conflict of like not having like the room available or the pharmacy being like already preparing like too many drugs on that morning. And then like last minute, we are asked to change a little bit the schedule. A few lessons learned. So being referred outside participant is great, but be still prepared for the workload. Like it can still occupy your study coordinator pretty much like full time initially when you get a very performing like referral like system, either by social media ads or Celiac Disease Foundation. And you have to think about it when you budget it with the sponsor, because if you budget only for like the actual visit that you eventually do, all that time initially with your study coordinator working is not like compensated. Anticipate staffing changes and avoid having someone new at the beginning of the study. This is the crucial part where you have to get people in, you have to screen as much as possible. So it's not good to have someone like starting their first few months, you don't know them very well still, and then you realize last minute that it may not be a good fit when it's a crucial crucial moment in your study. Keep great relationship with your endoscopy unit, clinical research center, and research pharmacy teams. They can really help you out, especially when we had the IV fluid shortage 2 years ago. Aim that your first participant screen enroll be a participant that you already know who will be understanding if the visit takes longer, because it's kind of like the first time you're doing the technology for the randomization, for registering the participants. So it's kind of like almost a general like a pre-show thing. So if you have like a participant who's used to come to your research like studies, it's always good to start with that one. And always remember that anything can happen. Flexibility and open communication with the participant like greatly help. And finally, it's important to make sure that any possible recruitment methods are in your initial IRB submission. Depending on the turnover with your IRB, you don't want to lose like months in recruitment because you could not like advertise in one way or the other. Be a participant advocate with the sponsor. So first, budget your study for your participants. So think about appropriate participant stipends, gluten challenge stipends, travel appropriately compensated, possibility of an hotel room the night before the endoscopy, having the over-the-counter medication costs covered, and having gluten-free meals and snacks at your center. And oftentimes your relationship with the participant greatly help maintaining them in the study even if they are having some side effect. But if it's a non-negotiable for them to stop, or they could continue with a reduced dose of the gluten, it is your role also to represent them and their wishes to the central team, the sponsor. But on the other end, make sure that your participant feels comfortable reaching out as soon as anything new is happening, they're having side effects, or they're having any unrelated health issue, because you need to know, and you don't want to learn like after the fact that something happened and you have to drop them out of the study. And in summary, celiac disease research is unique, but your celiac center is well equipped to understand these challenges. Establishing a relationship and open communication with the participant is key. The site performance, in my opinion, is determined first on early and efficient pre-screening, mostly by your study coordinator at first, and the subject retentions. That is a team effort between your study coordinator, your other investigators, and other members of the study team. And finally, trust your initial assessment. Like if you have some doubts, it's always better to screen fail than eventually discontinuing a participant at the middle of the study because they end up not being super compliant with the study procedure. So with the screening visit, get to know the participant, and yes, trust your initial assessment. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and Marilyn will continue.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining today, and thank you to Dr. Therian for that wonderful presentation. Very comprehensive. So now I'm going to share some insights from the Celiac Disease Foundation's recent white paper examining recruitment, retention, and site performance in celiac disease clinical trials. Our goal with this work was to understand what actually distinguishes high-performing sites, not in theory, but in real-world practice, and to translate those lessons into strategies that can be adopted across the field. So, recruitment does remain the primary bottleneck in celiac disease clinical trials. Even though we now have a growing pipeline of investigational therapies and a highly motivated patient population, enrollment does continue to lag behind what's needed to move trials efficiently. What we found is that site performance is one of the strongest determinants of trial success. How quickly sites respond to referrals, how they communicate with patients, and how they structure their workflows all directly affect enrollment speed, participant experience, and completion rates. Improving your site performance is not just an operational issue, it's central to accelerating the therapeutic development for people with celiac disease. So, to better understand site performance, we conducted a mixed method study of U.S. celiac clinical trial sites. We interviewed 10 principal investigators and 10 site coordinators with hands-on experience running celiac trials. We analyzed both recruitment and retention workflows, focusing on identifying the practical behaviors and systems used by successful sites. And this was not an abstract academic exercise. It was designed to capture operational intelligence that can be applied immediately by other sites and sponsors. So across sites, we saw a consistent set of recruitment barriers, as Dr. Therian discussed. The gluten challenge was the most frequently cited deterrent, particularly concerns about symptom reoccurrence. Sites also reported challenges related to stringent eligibility criteria, logistical burden of study visits, and delays in obtaining outside medical records. Another important factor was variability in referral outreach. Some sites used persistent, structured follow-up strategies, while others stopped outreach earlier, which reduced their screening pool. And these barriers are not unique to any single site. They're systemic challenges that require intentional operational solutions. When we looked at the highest performing sites, several patterns clearly emerged. These sites responded to referrals rapidly, typically within 24 to 48 hours. They used persistent, multi-channel outreach strategies and invested heavily in early patient education. Principal investigators were actively involved in recruitment conversations, which built trust and credibility. And perhaps most importantly, these sites operated with structured internal workflows. Recruitment success was not accidental, it was the result of deliberate systems. One case study illustrates how operational discipline translates into performance. This site contracted referrals within 24 hours and extended outreach well beyond the typical 3 attempts. They used multiple communication channels, phone, text, and off-hours outreach, and even scheduled evening and weekend calling sessions to reach working participants. This persistence maintained momentum in their referral pipeline and significantly improved enrollment efficiency. The key takeaway is that responsiveness and persistence are not optional extras. They're central drivers of recruitment success. Another high-performing site focused on early trust building and education. They sent informed consent materials ahead of the first visit and used visual timelines to help patients understand the study journey. The principal investigator met one-on-one with interested participants to explain safeguards around the gluten challenge and reinforce that participation was voluntarily and medically supervised. This proactive communication reduced hesitation and strengthened enrollment commitment. Patients felt informed, respected, and supported. Retention success followed a similar pattern of intentional engagement. High-performing sites maintained regular, proactive contact with patients between visits and ensured easy access to staff. They offered flexible scheduling and created comfortable, participant-friendly environments. Some sites shared personal health insights from study testing, which increased participant investment in the process. These strategies built trust and connection, resulting in consistently strong completion rates. A major finding from our study was the impact of the partnership with the Celiac Disease Foundation. Sites consistently reported that advocacy-supported recruitment expanded their reach, accelerated enrollment, and improved participant engagement. Participants referred through advocacy channels were often more informed and motivated, which improved both conversion and retention. And this partnership also enhanced site credibility and trust within the patient community. Advocacy collaboration should be viewed as a strategic asset, not an optional supplement. High-performing sites track their performance deliberately. Key metrics include referral response time, conversion rates, enrollment pace, and retention outcomes. Measuring these indicators allows sites to identify bottlenecks and implement targeted improvements. Data-driven performance monitoring transforms recruitment from a reactive process into a continuously optimized system. From these findings, we developed a practical best practices toolkit. Several themes stand out. Again, early and persistent engagement drives recruitment. Operational readiness multiplies impact. Tailored communication builds trust. Reducing participant burden supports retention. And advocacy partnerships extend reach. These are actionable strategies that sites can adapt to their own contexts. The broad implication of this work is that we can scale success across the celiac trial ecosystem. By standardizing high-performing workflows, sharing operational knowledge, and strengthening partnerships, we can build more efficient recruitment pipelines. Ultimately, improving site performance accelerates the development of therapies that patients urgently need. So I thank you and I look forward to discussing how we continue together advancing clinical trial excellence.
Thank you so much, Marilyn. Definitely a lot of interesting things to think about after both Dr. Therian's and Marilyn's talks there, and hopefully we can continue to improve site performance across the board. So, with that being said, I think at this point we can pull up the closing remarks slide. Okay. Well, again, thank you to our wonderful speakers today, and I hope everybody enjoyed the talk as much as I did. And I'm excited to. Oh, my apologies. There isn't a question and answer slide I see, but I'd be happy to entertain questions from anybody who is here, or I can come up with some questions myself.
I have a question.
Sure.
I thought you were skipping over. I was going to let you do closing remarks and then I was going to ask a question.
Yeah, my apologies.
No. So first of all, I think this was fantastic. I wish there were more people who were on this particular webinar. I think there's so much that I learned, and I'm sure that there are so many things that we could all learn from. So hopefully there'll be more people listening in the future. But definitely something that needs to be advertised a little bit more heavily, Vanessa and Megan, in terms of even after this, because there's so much that we don't know. And just putting it in words, and I think both you, Amelie, and Marilyn did a fantastic job. I'm listening to this and I am thinking it's an overwhelming task to set up a center like that. So, what's out there to make someone feel like, okay, I should get involved, I should dip into this arena of celiac disease? Because as I'm listening, like, oh my God, how am I going to do this in PEDS GI? What words of encouragement would you have for centers that, and especially if we're thinking about pediatrics in the future, how do we get people excited? I think excited is not the word, but how do you feel less overwhelmed about this?
I mean, it's not necessarily overwhelming if you have some protected time and if you have like a good team to support you. And the longer your study coordinator stays with you, the longer they can help with all of the setup and everything. And I really enjoyed like getting to know like the clinical trial participants over their course of their studies, and also like to really know like how is the protocol of the drug, like how is like what is happening during the trial, like, and then like compare that with the final like publication, final results. Like I think it's essential that we do those clinical trials, and for me it's more rewarding than, but it's still again a lot of like work that we're not like only doing that. And so it's also like to let the sponsor understand that we're not only doing that, we are also like having clinical patients and other like clinical activities.
So overwhelming in the sense that if you don't have that infrastructure, like how do you go? Oh, thanks, Marilyn. Yes.
I'd like to add.
Yes,
So,
please.
the Celiac Disease Foundation does a lot of upfront work with the trial sponsors before the patient gets to clinic. Everything from working with protocol development to make sure that it is participant friendly. We run patient advisory panels where the patients actually walk through the sponsor's proposed protocol. Everything from if you expect me to spend a couple of nights overnight, you better have Wi-Fi in an area where I can set up my laptop, to what Dr. Therian brought up, which is if I'm going to do a gluten challenge and I have to drive any distance, I need to be near a restroom. You need to think about putting me up overnight in a hotel. I mean, we really tackle all of those participant-friendly pieces. Then we work with the advertising or the marketing materials to really help the patient understand that the foundation partners, and we have a global network of partners throughout the world, we vetted these sponsors. This is a trial that's run through our scientific advisory boards, through our SSCD, to make sure that they are safe for patients and address those issues of going to do a gluten challenge, what's going to happen to me next. So we really spend a lot of time in the marketing advertising piece of it. Then when patients go through screening, we have an in-house call center, and these people on our call center all have celiac disease or are familiar. So we spend a lot of time talking to the patients, explaining things. So by the time they get to your clinic, we've done everything we can to make sure that we have funneled to the most motivated, engaged patient so that we are not wasting your time. When you put out a social media ad without that funnel of the screening and the call, then the clinics become completely overwhelmed and you're working with a study coordinator who's calling through a list and is completely wasting their time. So what we've really tried to do is put together a process so that the front end of it is that you're going to get that patient who's motivated, who understands they may be ill, who understands there may be scheduling issues, that there may be bumping issues, that there's going to be an endoscopy, all of those different things. And that won't discourage them for continuing your trial. So just want to let you know that our goal is to partner and take that overwhelming part of it and really work with the sponsors and give your feedback. The other thing is we do site investigator kickoff. And so we work with the PIs and the coordinators at the kickoff meeting with the sponsor to really address what the best practices. So just saying that, know that you have a partner and that the overwhelming part may just be your own clinic time and getting the patients through, but we're doing everything we can to make sure that your patients are not the burden part of the study.
Yes, and I've lived both, like social media referral and Celiac Disease Foundation referral, and I can say that yes, there's a difference. Like the patients are more like pre-selected, and we are less like kind of like putting aside like people who in fact like do not have celiac disease or have like other stuff. So yes, so that recruitment through Celiac Disease Foundation really works.
So that obviously is a big relief, and perhaps maybe more of us need to know that. Maybe we should be knowing, but we don't. But maybe it's because I'm in the pediatric space. But that definitely takes away. So, Marilyn, is that something the screening even looking at to see does a person really have celiac or not? It's to that extent.
So we work with the sponsors to develop the questions in the screening tool. Some screening tools are more simple. Some have, two parts where if you pass the first round of screening, then there's a second screening. And then we work again with the study phone call and what that script should be like. So it's tailored differently to each sponsor's need.
That's amazing. I mean, obviously, hopefully, pediatrics will get some drugs and we'll be able to do the partnering. But it just that I agree with you, Marilyn, takes away a huge chunk of what Amelie had truly defined very clearly in terms of the steps that need to be there. But um, thank you. Awesome job, though.
So I have a question about social media, and especially as we look towards perhaps getting adolescents into clinical trials. I know there's been a couple of social media influencers who have started um, chronicling their experience in clinical trials, and some that have borderline, shown like the vials and, barcodes. Has there been any discussion in the community about how we're going to address that, or if we need to start having, rules in the consent forms about what people can and can't share from their visits?
I think we should technically for at least for our center because it's not allowed at our center to film inside of the hospital. So if our center ends up like knowing that this is happening, our studies may be in trouble. So unfortunately, if I have a participant who is doing that, I will like re-explain that it's not allowed at our center.
I had a question too, Dr. Therian. It sounds like it's a very personal approach that you take and the hands-on approach that you take with the clinical trials, and that's awesome to hear. And I'm curious, just because I'm in the adult world, like when it comes to pediatric trials, how do you expand, like get the parents involved and kind of keep them along the way? Because I imagine they're just as important for younger patients in terms of consent and in terms of making sure that there's understanding of the clinical trials. How do you keep that relationship with the parents as well?
Are you asking me or Dr. Verma?
Oh, just in general, but yeah, Dr. Verma too.
Because I'm an adult gastroenterologist
Ah,
too, so I don't have
mm,
much experience
right,
with the
right.
parent relation and the.
I think that, the adolescents are the best example, as Vanessa mentioned, to
Hmm.
bring those,
Yeah.
and obviously they need to sign and the consent and so on.
Mhm.
I think drugs in the younger child are probably not going to work that well to start with.
Mhm. Right.
But the adolescent is prime. I mean, I've been telling everyone we need the adolescents in every trial because those are the prime group that need to be in these trials. They are the ones who have eat gluten and have those behaviors, and they are ready. I mean, those adolescents are ready for a medication. But
But
I think the parents are ready too for that age group because they
Mhm.
don't have any more control. So as parents, we want control over our children, and
Mhm.
that they don't have. I mean, these kids are doing whatever. So that's a huge market there.
Mhm.
But other than for summer months, like we would need to completely adapt like the schedules and the way we do things to enroll adolescents because we cannot like have them miss
Mhm.
school to do like research visit. So it will be
Right.
either like to have visits on the weekend or later in the evening. Um,
Weekends and evenings, and then they have lots of spring breaks and summer breaks and summer, the winter breaks. There's a lot of breaks there, but truly, I don't think that that will be a problem once we get something there. It's probably going to explode more in that market than it will in any other market.
I was going to add that the Celiac Disease Foundation really runs because of the parents and the grandparents, right? It is a very motivated audience to make sure that their offspring or grandchildren have a therapeutic. So I agree with Dr. Burma. I think when those opportunities become available, the parents will be your partner in this.
Awesome. I really appreciate that insight from everybody. Were there any other questions in the audience?
I have one last question for Marilyn. Can you share a little bit more, like how much like patients you are able to send to site for like studies in general, like kind of like a range order?
So it really depends on the location, obviously. If you're in a more urban area where there are more celiac patients, it becomes easier to fill the trial. But what we do is we work with the sponsors to identify the clusters of celiac disease. So we have a site database of more than 200 sites in North America. We're able to tell the sponsors what the high performing sites are. So that's why our goal is to be able to share insight to help everybody become a high performing site where you are able to attract more patients. But what happens is it's a big patient load. When we first announce a trial, usually on day one, we have upwards of 4 or 5,000 patients who will fill out the survey. So I want to be clear about social media. We do advertise the trials on social media, but what we do is we direct them to the screener and the website that explains everything. So you're not just getting the patient directly from social media. It can be overwhelming for sites. We just launched in Europe with the trial this year, and the sites actually had to shut down because our patient partners who take these marketing materials and give them to their patient community, the sites were completely overwhelmed by patient interest, which is great. And that was a lesson learned. But the response from patients, and again, screened interested patients, can be overwhelming for a site that's not used to that, who knows that, they've been struggling for 2 years to find a patient. So again, lessons learned, we're working through, but the partners of the sites are now understanding that once the patient groups are involved, they really need to have their study coordinators up to speed because day one, you may have, 10, 20 patients in your pipeline for your particular site, or if you're a more urban site, even more. The good news is the patients are motivated.
Excellent. Any other questions from the audience? This is great.
Well, I'd
All right.
personally like to thank the SSCD for showcasing this opportunity. Speaking as both a celiac patient now, recently diagnosed, and the mother of a son with celiac disease, and now many, many more family members who've been diagnosed over time. The idea that there is a focus on getting a therapeutic to the line by our celiac research community, we're grateful. Patients need this. So the time that you take outside of your regular clinical load to bring this on is absolutely deeply appreciated. So thank you.
And thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Therian, and thank you, Marilyn. Without further ado, I just want to thank everybody else for attending, or if you're listening to this after the fact, thank you for listening. And I just want to point attention to an upcoming webinar, which will be again at 1 p.m. on April 8th. It's going to be measuring outcomes and regulatory compliance. And you can register. The link is right there. And you can keep up with us by going to the celiacsociety.org and keep up with everything that's happening with SSCD. And of course, a special thank you to my colleagues on the webinar committee, Dr. Therian again, Sharon, Vanessa, Megan, the whole group. It's a wonderful crew here. And the SSCD Council at large, thank you so much for this opportunity. And I wish everybody a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.